just haven't thought about it. It wasn't anything well, anyway.
Is it your
Hello,
birthday
it's
today?
this and that.
Oi,
20.
you. I don't care if it's live. Is it your birthday today?
No, 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 no.
Oh, right.
My birthday was 2 months ago. Anyway,
Oh, right. You meant for somebody else. Got you. Right, okay. Doesn't matter.
anyway, 20th of January, this and that. Welcome. Today we're going to get a little closer to probably stuff I really wanted to deal with, but we've been fiddling around with background information like Marx's Capital Volume 1, the new edition, but there are other little issues that were part of that. And I think that I like to think that as we've moved along here, that we've picked up a little bit of this and that on the way. And one of the things that we saw prior when we were looking at the issue of the fragment on machines, among other things, is the idea of so-called general intellect, which sort of comes and goes. We noted that some people seized on general intellect as it appears in the Grundrisse and tried to use that for a whole model of thinking about knowledge economics or the political economy of information, and that may have been a little too premature. But it is important to think about this idea of what counts as mental labor. And it's not identical to digital labor, but today we're going to talk about digital labor. We'll get there eventually. Note that according to Matteo Pasquinelli, the concept disappears in the transition between the Grundrisse and capital, as it is replaced by the notion of collective worker or Gesamtarbeiter. So whether that's a good or a bad thing, it's pretty clear that it is a kind of collective action one way or the other. So there are certain arguments about what counts as digital labor. I'm trying to move, sort of stuff I do for this little podcast thing, this piece of content, and things I really want to work on. And digital labor is part of that, but I don't premise my own work on digital labor. I'm more interested in how the larger issues sort of intertwine, like when I was talking before about indexicality and valorization and sublation, etc. Eventually, we're going to get there, but we sort of need to travel this really not an isolated path. It's an interesting path that remains problematic and is actually quite vital. A lot of people think about it, talk about it, and at the present moment in history, 2025, it would seem to me that we should be talking about this in particular relative to digital capital of one kind or another, but we'll get there eventually. So from this little piece on digital labor and Karl Marx by Christian Fuchs, who I've mentioned before as having certainly one of the leading positions on how to discuss this stuff. Let me read from that. I added some videos at the end, kind of at the current moment of, I think there's one video that you can only see on YouTube that has a session, a 2-hour session with Fuchs himself talking about Marxian political economy and digital labor. And so I hope that you might at least stare at that a little bit to see whether that works or not. I will be reading from two things today, Christian Fuchs and then Dar Withford's work. And I hope you'll find this useful and interesting. You'll have to probably go back and read it directly anyway. So here we go. This is Fuchs. A Marxist theory of communication should demonstrate how communication and culture are material practices, how labor and language are mutually constituted, and how communication and information are dialectical instances of the same social activity, that is, the social construction of meaning. Situating these tasks within a larger framework of understanding power and resistance would place communication directly into the flow of a Marxian tradition that remains alive and resonant today. A Marxist theory of communication sees communication in relation to capitalism, placing in the foreground the analysis of capitalism, including the development of the forces and relations of production, commodification, and the production of surplus value, social class divisions and struggles, contradictions and oppositional movements, all that. Marxist media and communication studies are not only relevant now, but have been so for a long time, because communication has always been embedded into structures of inequality in class societies. With the rise of neoliberalism, Marxist communication theory has suffered a setback because it had become common to marginalize and discriminate against Marxist scholarship and to replace Marxism with postmodernism. So Marx was always relevant, but being Marxist and practicing Marxism were always difficult, in part because Marxist studies lacked a solid institutional base. What we can see today is a rising interest in Marxist work. The question is whether it would be possible to channel this interest into institutional transformations that challenge the predominant administrative character of media institutions and strengthen the institutionalization of critical studies of media and communication. That's Fuchs's whole deal. Some scholars have said that Marx never commented on networked media, which is refuted by not only Marx's discussions of the telegraph, but also the one in which Marx describes a global information network in which everyone attempts to inform himself on others and connections are introduced. Such a description not only sounds like an anticipation of the concept of the internet, it is also an indication that Marxist thought is relevant for media communication studies and internet studies. This passage above in the Grundrisse is an indication that although the internet as technology was a product of the Cold War and California counterculture, its concept was already anticipated by Marx in the 19th century. Therefore, Karl Marx invented the internet. Well, Karl Marx, Al Gore, who cares? So Christian Fuchs and Nick Dyer-Whitford, these are kind of important people relative to keeping a certain point of view alive in communication and information studies. And so we'll look a little bit at their work today and perhaps down the road. There is, I would assert, a certain limit in political economy applications because it doesn't go as fully quantitative as I would like to see it go. But needless to say, it has a certain analytic character. And I have introduced some ideas about what that analytic character looks like when I was yakking a couple of days ago about whether we could go sort of Kantian on these sorts of things. But anyway, we'll get there. Christian Fuchs and Nick Dyer-Whitford have argued that 10 concepts especially make Marx's works crucial for understanding the internet and social media. Number 1, dialectics. Number 2, capitalism. Number 3, commodity commodification. Number 4, surplus value exploitation, alienation, class. Number 5, globalization. Number 6, ideology critique. Number 7, class struggle. Number 8, commons, the idea of a commons. Number 9, public sphere. And number 10, communism. The outlined concepts allow one to formulate an incomplete research agenda for critical internet studies that includes the following questions. Number 1, how can the creation, the development, and the contradictions of the internet be understood within a dialectically informed historical perspective? Number 2, what exactly is the role of the internet in capitalism? How can this role be theorized and empirically measured? Which internet-based capital accumulation models are there? Number 3, which forms of commodification do we find on the internet and how do they work? Number 4, which different forms of surplus value creation are there on the internet? How do they work? What do users think about them? Number 5, how does the internet interact with globalization processes? Number 6, which myths and ideologies are there about the internet? How can they be uncovered, analyzed, and criticized? Number 7, What is the role of the internet in class struggles? What are the potentials, realities, and limits of struggles for an alternative internet? Number 8, what are internet commons? How does the commodification of the internet commons work? Which models for strengthening the internet commons are there? Note TikTok. Number 9, what are the potentials and limits of the internet for bringing about a public sphere? And number 10, what is a commons-based internet in a commons-based society? Which germ forms and models of a common-based internet are there? How can the establishment of a commons-based internet and its corresponding struggles be strengthened? So these are all interesting sort of research questions. The fact is that it's clearly part of the current discourse. It's certainly something that you might think about in comparing, for example, Red Note with TikTok and a variety of other things. But that's for another time. I put this little graph in here because it's a output and labor input percent changes in the 10 industries with the largest gains in remote work between 2019 and 2022. And which is of course problematic because of it, it includes COVID, et cetera. But as we look down here, one of the key areas is funds, trusts, and other financial vehicles. On the one hand, it has high labor input and an increase or a high magnitude of labor input. But on the other hand, it has a negative component of output. So it is so remote work was very unproductive in some ways, and there is a kind of sort of an activity that is trying to get people back into work. So whatever that means. But I think we're not very clear about that in the current situation about the problems of remote work. Although it's pretty clear that capital really wants people under better control, whatever that might mean. So I came across another little thing on a conference a little while back. It's a immaterial labor conference, which to talk about immaterial labor is a very wide and interesting and problematic idea. But one of the ways in which you have to sort of tackle that is the question of a common or communal resources. And obviously it fits into a much larger question about what counts as the common can be a form of capital, but it doesn't have to be. And in fact, it depends on how you want to redefine it, where, is the common sacrosanct in that sense? How public is the common, or can the common be commodified, which is kind of what platform capitalism is about, is monetizing all of that sort of stuff. So Dyer Whitford is one of the people who actually has at least one handle on this. I'm not saying that he's right or anything, but he was one of the first people to, about a decade ago, to try and sort of work out some of these problems. And so he and Fuchs, I think, are people one should think about. Anyway, so this paper makes theoretical propositions to assist in conceiving an emergent communism, a coming community that is neither capitalist, socialist, nor anarchic, and the place within it of immaterial labor. Its argument, in brief, is as follows. Marx deemed the cellular form of capitalism to be the commodity, a good produced for exchange between private owners. His model of the circulation of capital traced the metamorphosis of the commodity into money, which commands the acquisition of further resources to be transformed into more commodities. We've been doing that for weeks now. The theorists of autonomous Marxism demonstrated how this circulation of capital is also a circulation of struggles, meeting resistances at every point. But although this concept proved important for understanding the multiplicity of contemporary anti-capital, it says very little about the kind of society towards which these struggles move, a point on which the autonomist tradition has mainly been mute. Today, new theorizations about multitude and biopolitics should reconsider this silence. Now, the point is, there's a lot of post-structural things going on here. Upperismo, a whole bunch of other things that are implied here. So hopefully, some of that will become clear as we move further along. I suggest that this is Dyer Whitford. I suggest that the cellular form of communism is the common, a good produced to be shared in association. The circuit of the common traces how shared resources generate forms of social cooperation, associations that coordinate the conversion of further resources into expanded commons. On the basis of the circuit of capital, Marx identified different kinds of capital: mercantile capital, industrial capital, and financial capital. We've looked at that before, unfolding at different historical moments, yet together contributing to an overall societal subsumption. By analogy, we should recognize differing moments in the circulation of the common. These include terrestrial commons, that is, the customary sharing of natural resources in traditional societies; planar commons, for example, command socialism and the liberal democratic welfare state; and networked commons, the free associations, open source software, peer-to-peer networks, grid computing, and the numerous other socializations of technoscience. Capital today operates as a systemic unity of mercantile, industrial, and financial moments. But the commanding point in its contemporary neoliberal phase is financial capital. And we've been hitting that point for a couple months now. A 21st century communism can, by analogy, be envisioned as a complex unity of terrestrial, state, and networked commons. But the strategic and enabling point in this ensemble is the network commons. These must, however, also be seen in their dependency on and even potential contradiction with the other commons sectors. The concept of a complex composite communism based on the circulation between multiple but commons forms opens possibilities for a new combination of convivial custom, planetary planning, and autonomous association. What follows expands on these cryptic observations. The circulation of capital. Marx famously described the commodity, a good produced for exchange between private owners, as the cell form of capital, the primordial point from which grew all its more complex and composite manifestations. As Marx says, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation, therefore, begins with the analysis of the commodity. Now, the processes of this growth were, however, not fully described until Volume 2 of Capital, which outlines a model of the circulation of capital. This model traces the metamorphosis of the commodity into money and back again. CMC. This cycle is expressed in the classic formula M-C LP slash MP P C prime M prime. Money is used to purchase as commodities in a C, including labor power, LP, and the machinery and raw materials that are means of production, MP. These are thrown into production, P, to create new commodities, C prime, that are sold for more money, M prime, part of which is retained as profit, part of which is used to purchase more means of production to make more commodities. Surplus value is somewhere in there, right? You can see that in the movement from C. Ultimately, by the time we get to M prime, something and go through several periods or moments, there's surplus value occurs. The money at the end of the process is greater than that at the beginning, and the value of the commodity produced is greater than the value of the commodities used as inputs. Repeat ad infinitum. Now, this circuit could, both in any specific instance or in general, fail. A C, a commodity, may not find its M, money, if a seller does not meet a buyer, nor M tryst with C if a buyer lacks a seller, and all may fall completely apart in the ugly abode of P, the production process. But if it surmounted these hazards, the circulation of capital becomes an auto-catalytic, self-generating, bootstrapping growth process, a constantly revolving circle in which every point is simultaneously a point of departure and a point of return. Now, there's actually math for this, so one should not, this is just not it's not just wordplay. There's actually a math for this. Now, this circuit is the dynamic process that converts the cell form of the commodity into what Marx termed more complex and composite forms, a process of organ creation, forming an entire capitalist metabolism that subsumes previous forms of the social body. It is, to use a different language, the path from capital's molecular level to its molar manifestation. The circulation process that begins with money and ends with more money is a never-ending process, but it can be punctuated in different ways. We could look at it beginning and ending with the act of production, or with capital in a commodity state, or in its money state, as David Harvey puts it. We can create these three separate windows to look in on the overall characteristics of the circulation of capital. From each window, we can see something different. In the end, of course, we're interested in the circulation of capital as a whole, but we cannot understand this without first understanding the differentiations within it. So, for example, the transformation of commodities into money, C-M, is the role of mercantile capital. That of the production of commodities by means of commodities, P, is mediated by industrial capital, and the conversion of money capital into productive capital is the ostensible task of financial capital, M-C. While all have an interest in the expansion of surplus value, they do not necessarily always agree about how to divide it up. These different sectors are both synchronic, have a both synchronic and diachronic aspect. That is to say, while they're simultaneously necessary for the fully actualized operations of capitalist society, each has subsumed preeminence at different times. Just to stop for a second, synchronic refers to the kind of moment in time, the kind of slice of time at which we, like synchronicity. And diachronic is the sort of passage of time, or the path that we're looking at. So, for example, the growth of mercantile capital from 16th to 18th century is often seen as the precondition for the emergence of industrial capital in the 19th century, which in turn has generated an increasing preeminence to financial capital in the late 20th century. None of these different subsets of capital replace each other, but at specific historical moments, one or other sounds a keynote or takes the lead for the entire ensemble. The ramifying elaborations arising from these circuits have been depicted by theorists who have developed Marx's model into intricate diagrams showing our current deep entanglement in the commodity form. If we think of a rotating sphere not only accelerating in velocity around its circumference, but expanding in diameter as it fills more and more space, we have the image of global capital, aka empire. The circulation of struggles. It was the great rediscovery of autonomous theory that the circulation of capital is also a circulation of struggles. Each node in the circuit of capital is a potential site of conflict where the productive subjectivities capital requires may contest its imperatives. If not all, at least many of the breakdowns in capital circulation occur because labor power, LP, refuses to remain labor power. It resists and reappropriates. Now, although this insight was given many expressions, perhaps the most complete English language version is the essay by Peter Bell and Harry Cleaver, Marx's Theory of Crisis as a Theory of Class Struggle. This proceeds systematically around the circuit of capital, showing the range of insurgent interruptions possible at each phase. Thus, the attempt to purchase the commodity labor, that is M-C, LP, labor power, could be interrupted by struggles over dispossession of populations necessary to create a proletarian workforce, or the maintenance of that workforce in a suitable condition of precarity. The purchase of raw materials, M-C, MP, means of production, MP is means of production, LP is labor power, might be frustrated by eco struggles. The moment of production, P, was the site of classic workplace resistances to exploitation, from strikes, occupation, sabotage. The sale of commodities, C-M, that is the second phase of this, right? MCM, was menaced by dangers from theft to boycotts to public reappropriation. Now, furthermore, each of these flashpoints might ignite others. This knock-on effect might happen as it were unconsciously if, for example, capitalists exposed to heightened costs for raw materials caused by resource wars responded by intensifying the rate of exploitation in production, thereby precipitating strikes, or responding to strikes by technological innovations that then overproduce so much that goods cannot be sold, which generate recessions, unemployment, and militant movements of the immiserated. But the connection could also be a conspicuous process as subjects contesting capital at different points, linked or allied with one another. The concept of the circulation of struggles underlies much of the richest thought about the use of means of communication, old and new, to link together these variegated agencies into new combinations. A line of analysis running from Romano Alquati's reflections on radiating the operational information of struggle to Cleaver's concept of the electronic fabric of struggle. In its intention, Bell and Cleaver's analysis of the circulation of struggle is an attack on objectivist Marxism that saw capital proceeding to crisis according to teleological laws. What they showed was that most of these laws were the outcome of colliding vectors of struggles waged by collective subjects. But ultimately, the concept of the circulation of struggles had even wider implications. In its various autonomous articulations, it decentered traditional Marxist concerns with conflict at the immediate point of production. A focus on factory resistance became displaced to a multiplicitous view of contestation throughout a circuitously interconnected social factory. Marx's singular old mole of the proletariat digging through the factory floor became the tribe of moles burrowing a network of tunnels through schools, households, welfare offices. This view of a widening circulation of struggles occurring at different nodes all along the circuit of capital, all potentially interlinked, is part of the genealogy of transversal politics and of the multitude, concepts which have become part of the theoretical lexicon of the contemporary movement of movements. Yet if the theory of the circulation of struggle both subverted objectivist Marxist accounts of crisis and decentered the classic Marxian focused on the immediate point of production, it also, in a very classically Marxian way, has little to say about the long-term outcome of these struggles. Yes, sufficient proliferation of such struggles will bring capital to breakdown. Reappropriating use values from this sphere of exchange, winning back time and life. Bell and Cleaver's wonderful essay ends by remarking that what defines a revolutionary subject is not only the negative power to abolish capital, but the positive power to increasingly define its own needs, to carve out an expanding sphere of its own movement, and to create a new world in place of capitalism. But the organizational or institutional forms this expanding sphere might take are unnamed. If today the concept of circulation of struggle speaks well to the multiple voices declaring another world is possible, to the begging question, but which world, or even if one wishes to emphasize the potential diversity of arrangements, which worlds, it does not answer. The circulation of the common, because the practical struggles of a multiplicitous movement and the theoretical reflections that arise in tandem with them have over the last decade and a half reached quite a high level, we might now be able to take another step. Having gone from the circulation of capital to the circulation of struggles, we can proceed from the circulation of struggles to the circulation of the common. The common and the commons are terms that have amongst activists recently become well common. The usual point of reference is the lands collectively used for subsistence purposes by pre-capitalist agricultural communities and destroyed by enclosure in the process of primitive accumulation. These were, in the medieval context, places where everyone could have a shared thing that wasn't part of the the tithe or sort of rental requirement of the manor, the stuff that you could grow for yourself, etc. Although enclosure was resisted by overt and clandestine insurrections whose full dimensions were only recently disclosed by Peter Linebaugh and Maurice Rediker's account of a Hydra-headed rebellion, these struggles were lost. But interest in the commons has been revived by opponents of global capital seeking a vantage from which to criticize the quote-unquote new enclosures, privatizing of natural and social resources across the planet. Some accounts romanticize the historical commons as a pre-capitalist utopia rather than a marginal supplement to a hierarchic feudal order. See, I just described it as a kind of a marginal supplement, whereas some people romanticize that things are freer or whatever, more equitable in a place where everyone sort of shares the work and seeds and labor, etc. Others invoke the commons only the better to plan their commercialization, but the concept remains an important lever for rethinking issues of collective production and ownership, and it is to this end, and with a profound debt to theorists such as John McMurtry and Massimo De Angelis, who have already thought along these lines, that it is deployed here. If the cellular form of capitalism is the commodity, the cellular form of communism is the common. A commodity is a good produced for exchange. A common is a good produced for shared use. Capital is an immense heap of commodities. Communism is a multiplication of commons. The commodity, a good produced for exchange, presupposes private owners between whom such exchange occurs. The common presupposes collectivities within which sharing occurs, collectivities that coordinate, organize, and plan this sharing. I will call these collectivities associations. We can thus postulate a circulation of the common. This traces how associations of various types, from tribal assemblies to socialist cooperatives or open source networks, organize shared resources into productive ensembles that create more shared resources, which in turn provide the basis for the formation of new associations. If C here represents not a commodity, but commons, and A stands for association, the basic formulae is therefore A-C-A prime as opposed to M-C-M prime. And, this is obviously has its own problematic element, but this can be elaborated as A-C ... P ... C prime dash A prime, repeat ad infinitum. So all you did was replace M with A. Two notes on this formula. First, we're dealing not only with commons instead of commodities, but with associations instead of money. The implication is that collective organization, not market exchange, governs the distribution of commons, whether through mutual aid, public planning, or gift economies. We will discuss this later. Second, in this formulation, the resources organized by association into commons production cannot be described as labor, power, and means of production, because these terms imply precisely the reductive abstraction and alienation that is inherent to commodity accumulation. Now, to indicate that human creativity and ecological riches become something other than just factors of production when organized through association, they are labeled here as GI, general intellect. See, we're back to general intellect, and NM, natural metabolism. So just at this moment, you could see that there's something going on here. There's an attention to this general intellect idea of knowledge, and NM, which is what Bellamy Foster et al. Have been concerned about, seeing it as a metabolic sort of construction. These may be the wrong terms, but we won't discuss this further because it's the topic for another paper. If an agricultural association A, on the basis of its successful cultivation of a common banana plantation C, joins together with another such associations, first to place more lands under cultivation and then to form an industrial packing plant, which then provides the nucleus for further cooperatively conducted activities, we have a circulation of commons. If the associative organization of a publicly funded education system researches collectively created software that provides the basis for open source associations, A prime, we have a circulation of commons. And if these open source software is then made freely available to our initial agricultural cooperative to enable its planning activities, we have a further circulation. The circulation of the common is thus a dynamic in which commons grow, elaborate, proliferate, and diversify in a movement of counter-subsumption against capital, generating the quote-unquote complex and composite forms of communism. Now, we can describe this composite complexity by analogy with Marx's differentiation of specific subcircuits within the circulation of capital. Similarly, we can differentiate specific moments in the circuit of the common, moments which give varied priorities in the basic relation of associations and commons, and which also have, at varying historical moments, had a different weight or importance. So we might speak of primitive communism, so-called, based on a terrestrial commons that involves the sharing of natural resources such as land, game, firewood, and water on the basis of associations shaped by custom. And so as these associations take as their foundation the apparently given quality of natural resources, we can say that they proceed from commons to associations, C-A. In contrast, various forms of planner commons emerged as a radical project for the public ownership and state management in the factories and urban conurbations of the Industrial Revolution. Insofar as these centered on the marshaling of new industrial capacities of production into forms of collectivity, they proceeded from production to commons, that is P-C. The main examples are the command economies of authoritarian socialism and the welfare state of liberal capitalism. But here are also the important minoritarian traditions of the cooperative and self-management movements. Finally, a networked commons proceeds on the basis of social communicative capacities from language on up that enable associative practices to occur. So the movement here is from A-C, A to C. Today, we're seeing an explosion of new developments in this subcircuit, including open source software, peer-to-peer network, grid computing, and other socializations of labor intrinsic to high technoscience, which we'll discuss further in the next section. Like the different types of capital, these different forms of commons have blossomed or blazed at distinct historical epochs. Indeed, the varying forms of capital and commons should be seen as each summoning each other or provoking one another into being. Thus, terrestrial commons were attacked by the forces of mercantile capital, which in doing so laid the basis for the industrial capitalism to which the planner commons was a response. The temporary success of these largely state-based commons was then undermined by the fluid mobility of finance capital, whose appearance is, however, inextricably tied up with the development of a means of communication, that is the internet, which provided the basis for the emergence of networked commons. The concept of the cycle of struggles can be rewritten as the story of this antagonistic spiral between the circulation of capital and the circulation of the commons. Because to date, capitalists mainly retained the initiative in this contest, many forms of commons have been partially destroyed. Although terrestrial commons persist, however imperiled in some peasant and indigenous communities, we have only a fragmentary understanding of how they worked in their heyday. To a great extent, planner commons have been conceived under conditions guaranteeing great malformation, and then yet further attacked and degraded. We are dealing often with an archaeology of the commons, that is, a set of ruins. But these ruins can also be, to use Frederick Jameson's fine phrase, an archaeology of the future. Complex communism. A 21st century communism can be envisioned as a complex unity of terrestrial, planner, and networked commons in which each reinforces and enables the other. As capital today operates as a systemic but differentiated unity of the mercantile, industrial, and financial moments of its circuit, so a contemporary communism would, from the cellular forms of the common, grow complex composite forms that combine the logic of mutual aid customs, governmental planning, and free and open source peer-to-peer networks. What a concept. The terrestrial commons today reappear today as the requirement for a set of ecological arrangements preserving the biosphere from exhaustion, the imperative of new habits and norms and daily practices in regard to Production and consumption is the great message of the green movement. But the need for a commons biopolitics extends beyond environmental questions to issues of climate control, epidemiology, and administering the biotechnologies, which are in effect producing a common global social body. The generation of new customs in common, adequate to the reality of this shared corporeality on everything from safe sex to recycling to emissions and cloning, is the issue of the production of subjectivity today. Such customs can neither be implanted, germinate, nor flourish without new forms of planning. Despite all libertarian objections, it seems to me impossible to envisage address of global poverty, disease, or climate change without the restoration of an ethic of public ownership and coordinated resource allocation at all levels. At all levels, municipal, national, and global. And at this last level, it would have to be on a scale that would in fact make some of the efforts of the planner states of the past look modest and circumspect. One basis of 21st century communism is the return, possibly too late, of the plan to redress the ruination of the planet from phantasmagoria of neoliberalism laissez-faire. That such planning could, however, be a nightmare is all too apparent from a legacy of catastrophic socialist experiments. The only way such planetary coordinations can take a radical democratic rather than a despotic technocratic one is through a mobilizing the capacities of the network commons to open forms of collective ownership and planning participation. It is in this context that we can locate the issue of immaterial labor, which I loosely interpret as those forms of communicational and affective production associated not exclusively, but strongly with digital networks. Here I make three propositions. Proposition 1. First, such immaterial labor is bringing into being a post-scarcity software economy whose commons logic troubles the commodity form. Free and open source and peer-to-peer networks are the 21st century's way of saying what Marx in 1844 called, quote-unquote, free association. Such experiments are not immune to commercial capture, but in their non-rivalrous plenitude and instantaneous circulation of goods, they create acute problems, private ownership, and market rationing. Contra the tragedy of the commons hypothesis favored by market advocates, foretelling the inevitable degeneration of resources outside individual ownership, such immaterial practices explore the possibilities of a cornucopia of the commons in which collaborative creation and shared use generate most robust and abundant goods. In this sense, then, the construction of a network commons has already been raised to a very high level. Second, the consequence of this development are flowing back through other common sectors, those of the terrestrial and planar commons. If the network effects was simply to stay in the realm of immaterial goods, that is music, games, films, intellectual production, it might be contained as an aberrant and ghettoized subsector of an otherwise unimpeached capital. But such containment is increasingly difficult. This is because the circulation of software is a traffic in tools that distributes as code instruments for production and planning. This has profound implications for the reinvigoration of a planar commons of public ownership and government coordination. The creation of the personal computer is arguably a major step in the socialization of production. But this step is already being extended by the creation of microfabricators, low-cost programmable machine tools that can print out what were formerly thought of as large-scale industrial artifacts, and also the tools to make even larger ones, promises to bring manufacturing the same informational logic that pervades the cultural field. If one starts to think of peer-to-peer networks of microfabricators running on open source software, one sees the possibility for a decentralized collective dispersion of industrial capacity to make the pioneers of workers' cooperatives delirious. Something of the same process is affecting even the politics of governmental planning projects. The electronic fabric of struggle is today made up of not just by the circulation of e-alerts, communiques, and guerrilla news, but equally importantly by a circulation of research instruments, cyber geographical tools, search capacities, accountancy packages, data banks, knowledge aggregators, spreadsheets, and simulators. This is affecting dissemination down to levels of molecular activism of administration, management, and planning capacities They were once the possession of the great molar concatenations of governmental and corporate power. In this sense, Lenin's aphorism that every cook should learn to govern the state, so bitterly ironic after the Soviet experiment where the state governed every cook, is being obliquely renewed. Some of the most dramatic implications of this network socialization of production tools bear on the new terrestrial commons of eco and biospherical concerns. Large-scale research projects, such as the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, global warming and climate change prediction, and epidemic control, requiring vast calculative capacities, are being realized through the myriad singular donations of unused computing cycles from individuals. Adopted on a very large scale, this would amount to voting with one screensaver, as to which programs of research to support a massive resocialization of collective knowledge, an exercise of general intellect. Instead, we have cryptocurrency. Let us take it as understood that these radical potentials can be actualized, not according to any automatic technology determinist progression, but only via struggles about not just the ownership, but the most basic design and architecture of networks, struggles that have to be not only fought, but fought out in detail with great particularity. With that understanding, and only with that understanding, are there grounds for suggesting that while a 21st century communism should be envisioned as a complex unity of terrestrial state and network commons, the strategic and enabling point in this ensemble is the networked commons of immaterial labor. The third proposition is, however, more cautionary. With the expansion of network commons created by immaterial labor that can circulate through other common sectors, the actualization of network potentials is also dependent on, perhaps sometimes even in contradiction with, transformation in these other sectors. Thus, whether or not the democratizing capacities of network commons are realized will depend on planar commons in constructing free or cheap access communication infrastructures. From municipal Wi-Fi hotspots to mass distribution of ultra-cheap laptops, in building educational literacy programs, in rolling back corporate IP regimes, and in establishing open source standards for public institutions. It is true also that digitally networked commons, dependent as they are on electrical supplies, on resource-intensive and computer fabrication, and on the generation of e-waste, places its own ecological load on the terrestrial commons. These types of interconnections, interdependencies, and possible contradictions between different sectors are, however, precisely what a model of the circulation of the commons highlights, and as an invitation to grounded utopianism. Conclusion, precogs. This long-sealed issue of left utopianism has, in fact, over the last decade, been reopened from numerous directions. This resurgence has taken its impetus from both the streets of Berlin and the jungles of Chiapas, from the fall of command socialism and the revival of anti-capitalist activism. It is, I suggest, an important move. In Milan, precarious entrants to the cognitariat, or immaterial labor force, have, using the metaphor of Minority Report, referred to themselves as precogs. Taking that metaphor seriously, let us see into the future to perceive not just its dangers, but its hope. This paper has attempted such a glance, while avoiding the locked gaze of the abstract utopianism Marx so famously criticized. Just as the idea of the circulation of struggles arises methodologically from the concept of the circulation of capital, so the notion of a circulation of the commons arises that of the circulation of struggle. Fights for commons, that is, terrestrial, planned, and networked, are happening. Complex communism is a forward projection of these aspirations. It is a concept of emergence, postulating the common as its cellular form and the circular regeneration of commons goods and associative organization as its dynamic of growth. It envisages a composite communism built from the aggregation and interlinking of such cells and cycles. Unlike the top-down, seamless blueprints of some other current left utopias, it envisages a communism bubbling from below. We might think by analogy with shifts in artificial intelligence research. Here, emphasis has, over recent decades, shifted from the programming of comprehensive and impeccable logic models to the assembly of many small units of code that can, in their interaction, bootstrap themselves albeit unpredictably, to higher levels of complexity. The motto of such research is fast, cheap, and out of control. We know so many people like that. Commons may be fast or slow, even better than cheap is free, but out of control, out of the control of the society of control, out of control from global capital. That is indeed the aim. By moving from a cellular model of commons and association that is simple, even rudimentary, this paper has aimed to suggest a process that is scalable, thinkable at levels from the domestic to municipal to the planetary, in terms of the interconnections between these levels, and by speaking of a communism composed by a circulation of distinctive modalities, terrestrial, planar, network, that nonetheless can be linked and reinforce one another. It has tried to wake from the hallucination, dream world, or nightmare of a uniform utopia of which Soviet-style socialism was the most notorious in favor of heterogeneous communism built from multiple forms of common logic, a communism of singularities. Under such conditions, it may be possible once again to say omnia sunt communia. So let me stop right there. There's a lot of ideas in here that are good ideas. They require a tremendous amount of energy and shifts in consciousness and politics and all kinds of other stuff. But I think it can be enacted at small scales and build on those things, understanding, of course, that it needs to be built on that way. You could say that, Mastodon is one small example of that, but it hasn't achieved, a kind of commons, fully enacted commons yet. But I would like to think that ideas like that, ones that resist the corporatization, the commodification, the monetization of certain digital features is still can be done. It can happen, and not fall into the corruption of however you want to describe it, the dark web, which obviously cryptocurrency is the gateway to. But anyway, that's just me. So let me stop there and see whether there's comments. Yes, Leonard Peltier was granted executive clemency. Hallelujah. There's still a couple of other people still behind bars that need to be released, and I think that that's really important. Let's see. Are there birthdays? I don't know. There's certainly passings today. Cecile Richards, who's the daughter of Ann Richards, the former governor of Texas, passed away. She'd had brain cancer for quite a while. Other things have occurred today. These are, all of these things are important. Granted executive clemency after 50 years of unjust incarceration and tireless efforts of intergenerational grassroots organizing and advocacy, our elder and relative, Leonard Peltier, has been granted executive clemency. It's not pardoned, certainly that's important as well, but, I assume that this means that he can be released into the, that will be a huge celebratory, at least on the left, event. And so I'm looking forward to that as well. Speaking of the commons, as it were, and particularly a indigenous culture that has commons elements built into it. Okay, so I've done my yammering. Let me, I think I have control of the live stream, so let me stop share. There's more to cover, but we could do that at some other moment. Let's see. No, I guess not. Joe, if you want to shut the YouTube off, I would appreciate it. We can get back to swearing at each other.